Welcome back. So hopefully you can tell that you're looking at Winston Churchill peeking underneath the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union on one side and the rest of Europe on the other. And we'll talk a little bit more about this cartoon later on. Here's a little review of the United Nations that we covered in the last lesson.
So imagine a world parliament. Imagine 193 voices gathering together in New York to deliberate over matters of peace and security. The United Nations was established in 1945 with the signatory of 50 countries for the express purpose of preventing the outbreak of war and averting a world war. The United Nations has many parts to it. It deals, for instance, with matters of economics and social policy. It deals with matters of human rights. It deals with matters of culture. But the most important parts of the UN are the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members who are responsible for controlling its policy. These are France, Britain, the United States, China, and Russia. The other body that is very important is where all the nations meet and come together, and that is the General Assembly. Both the General Assembly and the Security Council pass what I call resolutions to make policy for the world. The UN has been responsible for eradicating polio in Africa, for instance, of dealing with problems of debt or problems of other diseases spreading. The UN has been very important in making sure that human rights are observed. The most famous document is the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which has been ratified and kept by many countries. The UN, precisely because it's so complex, is determined to make sure that everything is done towards a big picture of peace and trying to make sure that humanity attains the primary purpose of what it says, that we believe. We believe in a better future.
Okay, when we left off, we were talking about Stalin refusing to allow free elections in Poland and becoming convinced that the United States and the Soviet Union were at odds with one another and they could not compromise. We talked about bargaining at Potsdam, and today we're going to talk about the Soviets tightening their grip on Eastern Europe. So the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as a nation of enormous economic and military strength. However, unlike the United States, the Soviet Union had suffered really heavy devastation on its own soil. Soviet deaths from the war had been estimated at 20 million people. Half of those had been civilians. And as a result, the Soviets felt justified in their claim to Eastern Europe. By dominating this region, the Soviets felt that they could stop future invasions from the West. And to be fair, that's where they had been hurt before. So Stalin decided that he was going to install communist governments in satellite nations. The satellite nations were nations that bordered the Soviet Union and acted as a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe, the rest of Western Europe. So he installed communist governments in those countries, in Albania, and Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Poland, and these countries became known as satellite nations, countries dominated by the Soviet Union. In the early part of 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing that communism and capitalism were incompatible and that another war was inevitable. At this point, the United States is trying to figure out, okay, now what are we going to do with the Soviet Union? And this goes back to yesterday when I introduced you to a guy named George Kennan, who is an expert on the Soviet Union and had spent some serious time in Moscow, actually. And faced with the Soviet threat, American officials decide it was time, in Truman's word, to stop babying the Soviets. So in February of 1946, George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, proposed a policy of something he called containment. By containment, he meant taking measures to prevent any extension of communist rule into other countries. So in effect, you were going to kind of corral it or contain it, keep it from spreading. By containing, This policy was meant to guide the Truman administration's foreign policy. So from this point on, this is what we're going to do. So Europe was now divided into two political regions, a mostly democratic Western Europe and a communist Eastern Europe. And in March of 46, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and he gave a speech that described the situation in Europe. These are his words. A shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. So the phrase, Iron Curtain, came to stand for the division of Europe. When Stalin heard about this speech, he said, in no uncertain terms, that Churchill's words were pretty much a call to war. Okay, Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So the conflicting United States and Soviet aims in Eastern Europe led to something called the Cold War, a conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union in which neither nation directly confronted the other on a battlefield. The Cold War would dominate global affairs and U.S. foreign policy from 1945 to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Truman Doctrine. The United States first tried to contain Soviet influence in Greece and Turkey. Britain was sending economic and military support to both nations to prevent communist takeovers. However, the British economy had been badly hurt by the war, and the former wealthy nation could no longer afford to give aid to countries such as Greece and Turkey. So it asked the United States to take over the responsibility. When President Truman accepted that challenge, on March 12 of 1947, Truman asked Congress for $400 million in economic and military aid for Greece and Turkey. In a statement that became known as the Truman Doctrine, he declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. So at the end of the day, what he's saying is that we have to go help those who can't help themselves and are being, forced into situations. Congress agreed with Truman and decided the doctrine was essential to keeping Soviet influence from spreading. Between 1947 and 1950, the United States would spend over $400 million in aid just to Turkey and Greece, greatly reducing the danger of communist takeover in those nations. So while the Truman Doctrine is kind of the public statement to the rest of the world that the United States will go help nations that are being manipulated by the Soviet Union, the Marshall Plan is the spending of the money, it is of getting goods into countries. So the Marshall Plan is named after a guy named George Marshall, who happens to be the Secretary of State under Harry Truman. And here's a little bit about it. So like post-war Greece, Western Europe was also in a great deal of chaos. Most of its factories had been bombed or looted. Millions of peoples were living in refugee camps, and European governments were trying to figure out how to resettle them. To make matters worse, the winter of 1946-47 was one of the bitterest in several centuries. The weather severely damaged crops, it froze rivers, it cut off water transportation, it caused a fuel shortage. So in June of 47, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the United States provide aid to all European nations that needed it, saying that this move was directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger and poverty and desperation and chaos. The Marshall Plan revived European hopes. Over the next 4 years, 16 countries received more than $13 billion in aid. By 1952, Western Europe was flourishing, and the Communist Party had lost much of its appeal to voters. So some of the countries that received the most, remember it was $13 billion in aid. More than $2 billion went to Great Britain, in fact $2.8 billion to Great Britain. $2.4 billion went to France, $1.3 billion went to Italy, and Then down the list, about 1.2 billion to West Germany, just under $1 billion to Holland, $500 million to Austria, anyway, and then the list goes down from there. Portugal got a little bit, anyway. Even Iceland got about $250 million. As Europe began to get back on its feet, the United States and its allies clashed with the Soviet Union over the issue of German reunification. At the end of World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones, occupied by the United States, Great Britain, France in the west, and the Soviet Union in the east. In 1948, Britain, France, and the United States decided to combine their 3 zones into one nation. The western part of Berlin, which had been occupied by the French, British, and Americans, was surrounded by Soviet-occupied territory. Although the 3 nations had a legal right to unify their zones, they had no written agreement with the Soviets guaranteeing free access to Berlin by road or rail. So Stalin saw this as an opportunity. He saw it as a loophole. If he moved quickly, he might be able to take over the part of Berlin that was held by the 3 Western powers. So in June of 1948, Stalin closed all highways and railway routes into West Berlin. As a result, no food or fuel could reach that part of the city. The 2.1 million residents of the city had only enough food to last for approximately 5 weeks. The resulting situation was very dire, and it led to something called the Berlin Airlift. American and British officials soon started the Berlin Airlift to fly food and supplies into West Berlin. For 327 days, planes took off and landed every few minutes around the clock. 277,000 flights brought in 2.3 million tons of supplies, everything from food to fuel to medicine, even to Christmas presents that the plane's crews brought in with them with their own money. West Berlin survived because of the airlift, and in addition, the mission to aid Berlin boosted American prestige around the world. By May of 1949, the Soviet Union realized it was beaten, with regards to the blockade anyway, and lifted it. At that point, we have the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic form. And so there will be a West Germany and an East Germany for a while. Okay, as it becomes pretty obvious that the United Nations is going to be a place where there is still struggle, a new alliance gets formed. So in the same month, the western part of Germany officially became a new nation. The Federal Republic of Germany, also called West Germany, was created, and it included West Berlin. A few months later, from the occupation zone, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, called East Germany, and it included East Berlin. The Berlin blockade increased Western European fear of Soviet aggression, and as a result, the Western European nations of Belgium and Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal joined with the United States and Canada on April 4th of 1949 to form a defensive military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. The 12 members of NATO pledged military support to one another in case any of the member nations were attacked. For the first time in its history, the United States had entered into a military alliance with other nations during peacetime. The Cold War had ended any hope of a return to U.S. isolationism. Greece and Turkey joined NATO, as you can imagine, since they'd received the $400 million, right? By then, NATO kept a standing military force of more than 500,000 troops, as well as thousands of planes and tanks and other equipment. And I would remind you that NATO is it's like the Three Musketeers. An attack on one is an attack on all. This is a much more aggressive military alliance. NATO is with the United States in Afghanistan in the War on Terror. And let's see what their website looks like. This is NATO. It has its own General Secretary. I believe it's still Jens Stoltenberg. I'll check that in just a second. Okay, today NATO is made up of 30 independent member nations. I'm going to scroll quickly while I talk to you a little bit so you can see the 30. It is still led by a guy named Jens Stoltenberg. An attack on one's an attack on all.